Hello, everyone, and welcome to Decoding Westworld, a podcast about the HBO original series, Westworld. I'm David Chen.
I'm Joanna Robinson.
And welcome to the show, ladies and gentlemen. You can find more episodes of this podcast at decodingwestworld.com. You can also email us at decodingwestworld@gmail.com. Each week, we will recap this week's episode of Westworld. Today, we're going to be talking about Season 1, Episode 2, entitled Chestnut. Now, before we get into this week's episode, Joanna, I do feel the need to mention that we went through a bunch of different names for this podcast. Like, we just launched this podcast less than a week ago. It's on iTunes right now. You can subscribe to it there. It's also on Pocket Cast and a bunch of other places. And when we were deciding whether or not to make this podcast, we had to choose a name for the podcast, right? And you actually put the call out for people to submit names. And we went with one of the most boring names, which is Decoding Westworld.
Yes.
But here's the benefits of Decoding Westworld. Number one, it's very easy to say and remember. Number two, the URL Decoding Westworld is available. And that's it. Those two reasons are the big reasons.
Can I share my favorite one that we didn't use?
Yes, you may. Well, the only other thing I wanted to say is, like, you kind of understand immediately what the podcast is from hearing the name. You know, like, it's very clear what it is, whereas some of these other podcast names would not necessarily lend themselves to that. So that being said, there were some awesome names. Joanna, why don't you share some of them with us?
Yeah,
or your favorite one. Yeah.
I should say that I believe the source of Decoding Westworld was Ronan Mehigan, at R Mehigan.
Nice done.
Yeah. You thought I wouldn't be butchering names on this podcast. You were wrong.
Yeah.
So thank you for that, Ronan. My favorite came from someone, Mackenzie Prime, at Right My Wrong, WRITE, My Wrong. And his suggestion was... or her, I can't tell. Two people in the profile photo. Even Rachel would listen to this podcast.
Rachel would listen to this podcast.
Yeah. Which I just think is the most charming thing I've ever heard.
It is amazing.
But no one will be able to find us on iTunes. So I'm sorry that we went with the more sensible option from Ronan. But thank you, Mackenzie.
I think my favorite one was How the West Was 10011.
Yes, that was so good.
That's probably my favorite one.
It was really good, too.
It's very good. And there were a bunch of other ones, like As the Westworld Turns and other wordplay that was going on.
We got so many suggestions. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, so just wanted to acknowledge that people asked for this podcast to exist. They also suggested names for the podcast. And so really, this podcast belongs to the listeners in many ways. And you can always email us at decodingwestworld@gmail.com. We're going to probably use top of the show or the end of the show to talk about your emails and theories. So looking forward to those emails coming in. Anyway, why don't we get to this week's episode, Season 1, Episode 2, Chestnut. What we did last week, and I think we're going to try it this week again, is firstly talk about overall thoughts, then talk about our favorite things of the episode, then things we thought that were weak, and then finally concluding with some theories, some questions that we have, and that kind of speculation. So, overall thoughts, Joanna Robinson?
I think when I initially watched these first 4 episodes, and I'm only going to talk about the first 2, I was interested that this episode seemed to orient itself around Thandie Newton's character, versus last week seemed pretty firmly oriented around Evan Rachel Wood's character. And so I was wondering if sort of Lost style, we were going to get a different POV character in each episode. I'm not sure that that's the case, and I read an interview with the showrunners where they said that a lot of the Thandie Newton stuff, the Maeve stuff, was actually originally for the pilot, but the pilot was too busy, so they had to pull it out into the second episode. And that'll make more sense for some of the stuff we're going to talk about later. But
in some ways, it almost felt like a reboot of the pilot. Like, it felt like this could have been the pilot. You know what I mean?
Right.
It felt like they had too many ideas, and they just wanted to like kind of redo some things about the pilot almost.
Right, and especially since we got, these two new guests and this new major character in World played by Clifton Collins Jr. So there are three like new major characters introduced in the second episode, and that usually does mean that someone's gotten a lot of notes after the pilot and they've done some work on it. And there's nothing wrong with doing some work and trying to get things better. I liked this episode a lot. For the balance of the storylines, I felt the first one felt a little too crowded to me, and this felt a little bit like there was more space to breathe. And I really love the stuff with Thandie Newton's character, and I really love the new characters we met. So I would say I liked this one better than the pilot. I mean, and it had the benefit of not having to do as much heavy lifting in terms of world establishing as the pilot did.
Yeah, I really like this episode a lot as well. It did what I think any good episode, especially this early in a series, should do, which is it has some solid action, it has some intriguing new characters, it moves along the mythology of the world, and it concludes in very intriguing fashion. So really enjoyed Season 1, Episode 2, Chestnut, and let's talk about some of our favorite things about it. So what is one thing that you liked about this episode?
Probably seeing the way that the guests enter the world is a really vital and interesting thing to experience, to go along with them. And I think if I had one major complaint in the first episode, it would be that, or I mean, if you listen to the first episode of this podcast, I had a couple complaints, but I think one of the major things that I was looking for that I feel like this episode delivered was a character to really latch on to. And I think we find that in Jimmy Simpson's character, William, who picks the white hat and enters the park and seems quite sympathetic. And I'm not saying everything's going to be like sunshine and rainbows for him the whole way, but
he seems like the closest thing to an audience surrogate that we have. Because
exactly,
everyone else is either dispassionately working on the park or a psycho, in some way, because they're a guest, and the guests are all, they all seem like they're psychos from my perspective. Right. So he's the first one that doesn't seem like he just wants to fucking kill everything.
Right.
And for that reason alone, he is a good person for the audience to see him, see themselves in. He also, in a very timely reference, says that he's afraid of clowns, which I don't think we could have possibly predicted that would happen.
I know, it was good. I watched this the first time before the murder clown story picked up so much steam, and watched it again this week and was like, oh, that clown reference lands a little differently now.
All right, so I really enjoyed that part as well. I did have a question, and I'm curious what you thought of it. It shows how they enter the park. He's clearly walking through a long hallway, and then he ends up in a moving train.
Yeah.
Right? And physically, it feels like it would be impossible.
Yeah.
And so I think this lends more credence to the theory that you put forward last week, or that we referred to last week, that the entire Westworld is some kind of simulation of some kind, like a VR simulation that's not physically real somehow.
I think that's the scene that made me wonder whether or not it was real. I was trying to figure out the physics of the train, because you see him come in that door, and then you see Ben Barnes' character Logan also come in that door, and then the saloon starts moving and they're on a train. And I maybe someone can draw me some schematics that make 100% sense, but I watched it a couple times, and it still it seems kind of like Time Lord technology, like doesn't quite make sense to me. Right, I will say,
I'm curious if it's just a red herring, like if the showrunners didn't even think through like the physics of it, and they just said, hey, this would look cool, and they just did it, and that would be kind of disappointing to me, but it's not the first time that a sci-fi show has just like hand-waved some technology away. You know what I mean? So
that's true. The other thing I wanted to say about that is, there's a theory going around that we can talk about later, but I think a lot of people are weirded out that James Marsters isn't on that train, because last week we saw him sort of ride into town on the train. Like that seemed to be the start of his loop, was on the train.
James Marsden, yeah.
Marsden, sorry, thank you, James Marsden. This is from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. James Marsden, Teddy. We'll call him by his character name, Teddy, and that's what I will say is those are two very different cars. And if you look at the wide shot of the train, it's got many cars.
Yeah.
So like they're in a saloon car, which may or may not be the caboose. Like it seems to be the caboose if they entered from the back and then they're going. But like they seem to be in a saloon car. Teddy was in more of like a passenger, sitting down in seats car. So
Ian Monroe in the chat room, we're broadcasting this live right now. Ian Monroe asks, the logistics of the train are funny, but the train didn't start moving until they got on, so it's possible that it could have worked. I agree. That thought occurred to me too. Like maybe it didn't start moving until both these guys got on. Like the train.
Well, they were the last. They were the last passengers aboard. I mean, I think that's possible because like he notices the lantern swinging above the bar. Mm-hmm. That's how he first notices that the train
they're moving. Yeah.
So I feel like it starts after the Logan character gets on, but it's still, I still have questions.
Joanna, here is the biggest plot hole of Westworld thus far.
I'm ready, yeah.
Is put aside the incredibly heavy-handed symbolism of black hats versus white hats. Mm-hmm. This place has no brown hats. I mean, come on, guys! Like, brown hats is a regular staple of Western worlds. So, I don't know what the deal with that is. But you were not irritated by the, very on the nose symbolism there.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's nothing subtle about that. I think what's right is for us to worry about this William character because, like, the Logan character is going to pick the black hat. The William character is going to pick the white hat. But we want him to stay a white hat through his stay at Westworld. And I think the concern we're going to have going forward is like protecting his white hat status. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And it's a dumb binary way to think about it, but it's still like it matters for him to have such like a flagrant symbol of his innocence that could potentially be lost. And that's not a spoiler. That's just my concern. So, yeah.
All right, I will mention that I thought all the Man in Black stuff was pretty strong this week. Mm-hmm. He encounters Clifton Collins Jr., an outlaw who's playing an outlaw named Lawrence. Ed Harris has known this character for the years. Like, he's seen this character work and like knows all about him. But Lawrence has obviously been reset. Ed Harris is kind of like the Bill Murray character in Groundhog Day. He knows everyone and what they're doing, but no one really knows who he is. So he's very godlike in that way. And Ed Harris gets to be a complete badass this week and kill like 10 dudes, even though it kind of is not super fun given that they can't shoot him back, so it's kind of like a one-sided battle. But the way it's shot, I did think was very compelling and very thrilling. I have a feeling that it's not going to be for that long that the hosts aren't going to be able to fight back. It's just my guess.
Yeah. What's interesting to me is we talked last week about how one of the most enjoyable and sort of seemed like the episode firing on all cylinder sequence of last week was the saloon massacre to Paint It Black. And I felt a similar way about this massacre. I mean, he massacres these people and then he massacres a whole other town full of people. And I think, eventually I'm going to get a little tired of seeing androids just be shot to ribbons. There's no emotional stakes there, especially when they reset. But for right now, episode 2, like, it's still kind of fresh to the music cue kicks in and it's stylish, as you say. So
anything else that you liked that you want to point out about this episode?
I kind of, you mentioned Groundhog Day. I really liked knowing that this stuff with Maeve, Thandie Newton's character, was originally in the first episode, because then knowing that, watching it again, I was sort of noticing these patterns of threes. Like, let's say we had Dolores's dropping the can moment all three times in the first pilot, because she does it twice in the pilot and once in this episode. We see Teddy die twice in the pilot and once in this episode. And then we see Maeve tell her story about how she got off the boat and the sound she heard, like first voice she heard, and she does that three times in this episode. So I wonder if initially that was all in one episode, and then you have these sort of echoing patterns of threes, which I think is interesting and hard of them maybe to murder their darlings and like separate that out over two episodes if they had to spread all of that story out a bit more.
Yeah, but I still think it works. So in this way, it's kind of like an echo of the first episode.
Yeah, yeah.
And I dig that as well. On that note, the Maeve note, something I really enjoyed about this episode is the scene when she wakes, all that stuff with her being reprogrammed again. I liked the idea that Westworld, the theme park or whatever, is like any corporate environment where there's multiple groups of people grappling over the same, control of one thing. And so you have this technician who's working on Maeve and says, oh, those people in narrative must have given this person like all this aggression and she's going to undo it. And it struck me as very kind of like bureaucracy messing with the final product, which I thought was very cool to depict in this fantastical show.
Yeah, I like that too.
And then she wakes up while she's getting treated for a MRSA infection. So apparently the hosts can experience human diseases, which doesn't surprise me because they do have like flesh and stuff, right? They do need to feel human when you touch them. So it does strike me as plausible that they would have diseases. But she wakes up and it's very like The Matrix, like Neo waking up for the first time and seeing the real world. And we see a little more glimpse of how they do the reset. They're hosing off all these bodies with bullet holes in them. James Marsden looks very sad, just lying there in the corner. All that stuff I thought was very strong. On that note, do we think that the violent delights have violent ends? Like, is that a way for them to kind of spread the infection, as it were, to kind of jumble or mess with the code inherent in the system? Because
right. So we've seen the technicians use verbal codes, verbal commands, right, to change the way that the androids react. And we saw, Dolores' father said violent delays have violent ends to her. She said it to Maeve, and that seemed to sort of like wake Maeve up in terms of she was getting those nasty flashbacks to this like homestead massacre that was perhaps a different storyline that she was once part of. And so it seems like that's what they're going for, that it's an infectious glitch that can be spread with a phrase. That's kind of crazy, right? Like, I mean, like verbal commands are part of how they operate, so it's not totally crazy, but it's still like to make it so disease-like. And even Bernard and Elise character were talking about it being infectious, is a bold choice, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I really feel like they're going to have to explain this somehow. I feel like if they don't explain it somehow, it's going to be pretty unsatisfying. That's my position on it right now.
Yeah.
Because if it's just like, hey, these machines figured out a way to infect each other with this code that makes them recall earlier instances of their performance, I feel like it's got to be someone put it in there. Like Jeffrey Wright's character Bernard or someone else, like the other dude.
Well,
go ahead.
I think it's really important, like two really, really important things we learned in this episode is like one, Bernard is having conversations with Dolores that he's then making her like erase from her log.
Yes.
So in the most generous interpretation of that is that he's worried she's going to be decommissioned and he's trying to explore things about her without alerting his team to any kind of potential problem with her. That's kind of what he says to her. But, we saw him whisper something to Abernathy when he put him in cold storage. So we're dubious. And Ford raises the thought of sabotage. So not just like Ford's Reverie code has glitches in it, but like someone is intentionally making these androids do more dangerous things, destructive things. The other really important thing we learned in this episode is that some of the people who work in headquarters are androids. You have these white-clad hosts greeting the guests at the original platform before they put them on the train that we don't understand how it works.
Well, you're just assuming she's an android, Joanna. Maybe she's just really into guests that happen to come.
I think she says, we're all here for your pleasure.
Yeah, so maybe she's a human. Who knows? We don't know.
Also,
I think in the words of one of the hosts, if you can't tell the difference, does it really matter? You know what I'm saying?
It does matter. Well, okay, two things. One thing, I think we know that person's an android. The actress Tallulah Riley was once married to Elon Musk, and Elon Musk tweeted out a very charming tweet a couple weeks ago about her playing a deadly sex bot on the show and how hot she is. So, I think that's...
I was just giving you a hard time, but I guess...
But now you have an Elon Musk anecdote, so you're welcome.
I just should have known that Joanna would come back with a really well-researched tweet. So,
and then the other thing is, what that throws into question is, and this is something we raised last week in terms of secret androids. Are any of the employees we've met secret androids?
Right. So there is a scene this week between Bernard and Teresa, right?
Yeah.
And we find out that they're sex buddies, which, is a thing that happens. But then she mentions the fact that, hey, why do the machines talk to each other, right? And he says it's kind of their way of like practicing how to be more human, correct?
Right.
And then there's a passing reference made to like, oh well, why do you like talk all the time? Is that why you're so talkative?
She said, "Is that what we're doing now?
Right?
Is that what you're doing now, practicing?"
Right.
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
think...
Jeffrey Wright is like my number one guess for secret android, and like especially given the way that Ford sort of treats him like, he's a protege, he's a son figure, So I feel like Ford treats him as sort of a creation, and. Yeah, that would be my guess. Oh, the other big thing we need to talk about. I know we said we wouldn't do like a full recap, but I feel like we need to talk about the kid that Ford meets out in like the desert. I am very convinced that is, as are most people, a younger version of Dr. Ford.
Right.
Out there.
The evidence of this is, firstly, the evidence that he's an android is like at the end. Ford seems to give him some kind of command that makes him walk away, like staring into the middle distance. Doesn't seem human. And then he shares biographical details with Ford as well, right? So He's like, yeah, that's what my dad used to say. So it seems as though it's a young boy version of himself that Ford has created that he himself generally talks to.
Right. That's what it seemed like to me. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
To what end? Just to like keep him company, I guess?
Therapy? I feel like Westworld is a big time therapy for Ford. Like they're talking about daddy issues. Yeah, I feel like it's therapy. We also learn, right, that all the animals, or at least the snakes in Westworld, are androids.
Yeah.
This isn't just like a bunch of androids and then like real livestock. We already knew the horses were fake, but the snakes are fake. So maybe the flies are fake.
Well, at this point, I feel the need to interject that I was able to see the original Michael Crichton film Westworld this week. So you should assume I'm going to spoil the film in this episode of the podcast. So if you don't want to be spoiled on this 40-year-old film, then you should probably... go watch the film and come back. I don't know. I don't think it's that much of a spoiler because the film is decades old, and it's, a lot of the stuff from the film is probably not going to make it to the show, is my guess. But I bring it up because the snake was a major part of the film. So it's like a fun film Easter egg sort of thing. Yeah. Like they make reference, like the snake is like one element of the world that malfunctions. Like it actually bites one of the main characters. and that's how they start to get a sense that like, this world is not supposed to be what it is. Like it's deteriorating because snakes aren't supposed to be able to harm the humans. They're not supposed to be programmed to. So it happens like in a very similar environment to what Ford is in this week as well. So I think it's a nod to that element of the film.
Oh, nice. Okay. But it is interesting that like not only is a snake robotic, or people get mad when I say robot instead of android, so I'm trying really hard just to say android. Though if it's a snake,
It's a
an
snake,
android.
yeah. I think that's
Yeah, okay.
kind of robot, right?
Or a
machine.
droid, a snake droid. The fact that he can control it with gestures, which is something we hadn't seen yet, I think.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Almost like a hypnotist, so, or a snake charmer. But that's an added, like, adding to the iPad and the verbal commands. We have the fact that at least Ford can control some things with just a wave of his hand.
Right.
So.
Right.
Well, I wanted to ask you about the film because it's my understanding that the two characters, the William Logan characters that we meet in this episode, are also sort of plucked from the film, or there are like strong analogs for them in the film. Is that accurate?
Kind of. I mean, I should just say overall, I thought the film was not very good. The acting is pretty rough at times, and tonally, the movie is all over the place. At times, it's incredibly kitschy. At times, it's meant to be scary. The one thing that's really effective about the movie is Yul Brynner as the Man in Black, who basically plays a malfunctioning host in the park, who then goes on a rampage killing everyone. And then the last half of the movie is about stopping Yul Brynner's character. So it's kind of like a Terminator precursor in some ways, like that.
Or Jurassic Park, one might say.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, because it's one dude dressed in black, I feel like the Terminator analog is a little more clear. But
yeah.
Okay, so anyway, so are the characters analogs kind of in the sense that the original film features two protagonists who, like, one of whom is experienced at visiting the park and the other one who's not, kind of, but like that's where the similarities end. They don't behave anything alike, really. And in the film, the new guy is like gets really into the world. Like he starts by like killing the Man in Black, one instance of him, and then like has sex with a prostitute, and he's like, yeah, this Westworld place is pretty cool. Unlike the Jimmy Simpson character in this episode, who's like seems very resistant to the charms of Westworld, right? So I don't know. The only similarity is that there's two of them, and that one of them is experienced in Westworld and one of them's not. Like that's
okay.
Where I think the similarities end. So.
I did want to bring up that we have one of our live listeners, Raymond Terry, when we were talking about the Bernard is possibly a host theory. He says, I don't think Bernard is a host. In episode 1, he had a photo of a son, ? That he quickly hid in his pocket. He must have had a family at some point. And I wanted to say that I'm not unaware of that. And then we'll get more of like Bernard's story of his family and stuff like that. But I don't know that precludes him being a host, because as far
the
as
hosts all have backstories.
Yeah, as far as Rachel Wood is concerned, she's got a lot of like history as well. So yeah.
All right, well, let's talk about some of the other interesting elements of this episode. One of them is we find out a little bit more about the Man in Black's mission. He's trying to find the maze, right? And in order to do this, he calls it the deepest level of this game, right? Yeah. And the maze. And he has a great line in the show where he talks about the difference between Westworld and real life. Real life is chaos, but here in Westworld, everything adds up. Everything is there for a purpose, which I feel like is one reason why people take a lot of comfort in video games, in general. Is just that, like, there's an order to it. You know that everything was placed there for a reason. And I thought that was a really fascinating and beautiful way for him to put that. But anyway, he tries to force Clifton Collins Jr.'s character, Lawrence, to tell him where the maze is, torturing him, killing all of his men, and killing his wife. And finally, his daughter says, follow the blood arroyo to the place where the snake lays its eggs. I assume since you've seen the first 4 episodes, you know a little bit more about this, right?
Yeah.
All right. So then it would be useless for you to speculate since
Yes.
you already know the answer.
Do you want to speculate?
Well, I think the only thing that's kind of interesting is Blood Arroyo is similar to the term Red River, and the whole game that what's his name was announcing.
Yeah.
Lee Sizemore's character, Simon Quarterman's character, who plays Lee Sizemore. He was announcing a new game or a new plot line called what is it?
Something on the Red River.
Yeah, something on the Red River, right?
Like Adventure, Terror.
Odyssey on Red River.
Odyssey, okay.
Right. So it seems like those two are related. That's all I got. That is all I got. On that note, there's this amazing scene where Sizemore's character does introduce the new plotline, and he thinks Ford is going to have no problems with it because Ford apparently has not interjected his will into the narrative of Westworld for quite some time. But Ford does give him a hard time about it and says, like, we're not doing this, and apparently scraps the entire thing.
Yeah.
And feels like Sizemore worked really hard on that, so that's kind of depressing. But Ford says, the guests don't return for the obvious things we do, the garish things. They come back because of the subtleties, the details. They come back because they discover something they imagine no one noticed before, something they fall in love with. They're not looking for a story that tells them who they are. They already know who they are. They're here because they want a glimpse of who they could be. Joanna, did you buy that?
Oh, I did. Yeah.
I don't know if I bought it.
Okay.
I don't know if I bought it because...
Well, I don't know that it was the only... Do you mean as the reason why he did it or didn't do it? Or the philosophy behind the park?
Philosophy behind like his approach. Because so far, the majority of the stuff we've seen at Westworld, right, that people are enjoying, is killing and fucking. I mean, that's the majority of what we've seen. Now, there are other adventures, like that one guy went on that little quest to find that dude in the mountains, was the sheriff that malfunctioned. But I know I'm being incredibly specific about it. But, you know, overall, all we see is like wanton violence and extreme sexual activity, including James Marsden getting murdered this week for no reason other than that someone wanted to, right? So the idea that this park is helping people actualize in some way, in a way that like might be edifying, in the way that Ford talks about it, it just strikes me as a bit not backed up so far by what we've seen of the park.
Okay.
But you disagree? You think that Ford is right when he says that they're here because they want a glimpse of who they could be?
Well, I think he has two reasons for shutting this story down. And one is that he's building his own story, right? And he's sort of like, I mean, I think, we see this character, this Sizemore character sort of writing Ford off as this relic, this like old timer who should be decommissioned himself. And I think you don't ever want to count Anthony Hopkins out, like I think there are like glimmers of Lecter in this performance. He's, you don't have a God complex without, being a bit of an asshole. And so I feel like he was alphaing this guy to a certain degree, when he shut this whole thing down. And, he says to Bernard, you can't play God without like being close to the devil, something like that, being very familiar with the devil, something like that. So I think we don't want to sleep on Dr. Ford, here, but, in terms of the overall philosophy of the park, I don't know. I think it's possible. I think with Jimmy Simpson's character, I think we could see him wanting to be the hero, and so getting a glimpse of what he could be as the white-hatted hero.
Right.
And whether or not he figures out that he's not the white-hatted hero, we'll have to find out. But all
right. So you see there as being some glimmer of truth in there.
I think you're right that most of what we saw especially in the pilot, was just depravity.
Yep.
And I think that's why I think one of the reasons why this second episode works so much more for me is that it's not just about pure depravity. You've got the yin and the yang of like the Logan character and the William character, and two people exploring Westworld for different reasons. You also had like that family in the first episode who encounter Dolores while she's painting.
Yeah.
You know, they seem like they're not there to like kill people and like have an orgy as far as I could tell. So, you know, we'll see. We'll see what the guests are there for.
Yeah, I can't imagine bringing a child into that situation. You know,
I know it's so there's so many variables. You know,
Yeah. I guess my, random thought, by the way, that I've had since watching the Westworld movie and now watching the show is how do they prevent guests from harming each other, right? And we talked about this a little bit last week. Like, if they shoot a gun, the guest will feel it, but it's not really going to be a thing. In the movie, they have a preposterous explanation for it, which is like he's like, "Why don't you shoot me?" You know, like how do they prevent us from shooting each other? He shoots a gun at his friend, and it doesn't go off because he says these guns have sensors in them that detect heat. So, so when you point it at a machine, it's cold, which of course like makes
Doesn't
no
work.
sense. Makes no sense even in the universe because these robots are sex bots. You can't have sex with an ice cold machine.
They're warm, fleshy.
Trust me on this, guys. You can't have sex with something that doesn't feel warm. That's all I'm gonna say.
They're like warm. Yeah, they're warm, fleshy sex droids. Yeah.
Yeah, so it makes no sense at all. But also the question is, what about stabbing weapons? Like, what's to prevent someone from just taking a knife and cutting someone with it?
I don't understand how guests can't kill guests.
Right.
And I think the Nolans talked about this, and they sort of had a mealy mouth answer about like. They were talking about stampedes, like being driven by a stampede over a cliff, and they're like, "Well, the horses are trained to not do that." They did not address guest on guest violence.
Oh, stampedes over a cliff. I don't understand what this reference is. Like
This is Lisa Joy Nolan, right? And she's saying. The question from Entertainment Weekly's James Hibbard was, William is told he can't get hurt in Westworld. What about him being hurt by another guest? What's to keep a guest from stabbing him, thinking he's a robot? Is there a safe word? And she said, we talked a lot about the rules of the park. A lot of it isn't made explicit in the series, but there's something called the Good Samaritan reflex within hosts. So say you're in a bar fight and some guy has a knife and maybe there's even another guest that you didn't know and he thinks you're a host and he's going to stab you in the neck. In that instance, a Good Samaritan host would seamlessly intersect and get in that fight and literally take that knife for you. Now, accidents can happen, falling off a cliff and things like that. But it's mitigated somehow because even the animals, aside from the flies, are host. So no horse is going to buck you to your death. But I think that, doesn't really answer host like intentional guest on guest violence. Like accidental guest on guest violence, in theory, an android would be fast enough to stand between you.
Right.
Or, I don't know, a snake will shoot up off the ground. Who knows? But like once again, it just seems like there are too many variables to this setup.
Yeah, it feels like it feels like it's something that we're just going to have to be okay with. Like, as viewers, we're just going to accept. There's no explanation for why, the guests can't harm each other. Right. People in the chat room, though, again, we always broadcast live. We tweet about it when we broadcast on Decoding Westworld. And Ian in the chat room says, the bullets work on hosts because the hosts explode themselves when they're shot. That's the canon in my head, at least, makes sense. Which I never thought about that way, but that is pretty cool. The idea that the bullets in the guns don't actually do anything, and that the hosts, maybe their bodies can pretend they were injured. Do you know what I mean?
But just in this episode, we saw a glass get shot out of the Man in Black's hand by a host. So the bullet from his gun is enough to shatter a glass.
Okay, you're right. Ian's theory does not make any sense. But that would have been cool, though, don't you think, Joanna?
Sure. No, I just think you're right that like the rules we can chase our tails on this for a while, but I think they have to fudge the rules a little bit on this. And but that
simply because there's nothing to prevent guests from hurting each other. Like there's no system that can prevent that, really.
There really isn't. So. And like the thing we saw at the end of the episode, right, is Dolores digging up a gun. And I think what most people are assuming is that unlike the other guns, which are programmed not to hurt guests, this one maybe can hurt guests.
Right.
So, yeah.
So who is giving her the orders? Like, what's going on there? You know, who knows what's going to happen?
I mean, it seems like Bernard. It seems like the answer.
Right,
but,
because he's been having these private sessions with her.
Yeah, and we hear his voiceover at the beginning as she's walking out of the house at night. And at the end, she seems like she's talking to someone, even though we can't hear who she's talking to. So, yeah.
Before we get to final theories and questions, anything that you thought could have been improved this episode? I mean, we both really liked this episode. So
yeah.
But anything else that you thought, like, kind of rubbed you the wrong way or you weren't a fan of?
You know, when I was watching this episode, I too was watching it sort of wondering if this was a complete reworking of the pilot.
Right.
And I took a special, like, particular note of the fact that Rodrigo Santoro's character does not show up at all in episode 2.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, like, because he's kind of a cartoonish character, you know, like given the sort of reality of the world that they're going for Western tropes, but he is like a mustache twirling trope, right? And so I was like, is he like just too much and they got rid of him? I don't know the answer, but I do know the answer, but like that's the question I asked myself in episode 2. So, and it's interesting. I can't shut off my brain and not think about the various course corrections they made first after the pilot and then later when they shut down production, just sort of watching for those things.
Yeah.
Because like Tessa Thompson, this great actress who is in Creed and is in the upcoming Thor Ragnarok and a bunch of other things, Dear White People, she's listed as being in 9 episodes of the season. Obviously she hasn't shown up yet. But she seems like she would have a significant character, and I'm curious to see what that is. So,
did you catch what the player piano anachronistic song was this week?
It was Radiohead, right?
Yeah, No Surprises, I believe, right? No Surprises by Radiohead, with some interesting lyrics that I'll perform for you live dramatically now.
I'm ready.
A heart that's full up like a landfill, a job that slowly kills you, bruises that won't heal. You look so tired, unhappy. Bring down the government. They don't speak for us. I'll take a quiet life, a handshake of carbon monoxide, with no alarms and no surprises. No alarms and no surprises. No alarms and no surprises. Silent, silent. Pretty ominous stuff, Joanna Robinson.
It's dark.
Pretty ominous stuff for what's ahead for these characters. So, anyway, why don't we dive into theories and speculation now about what's going on? So, obviously, the big question that happens at the end of this episode is, what the hell is Anthony Hopkins doing, right? Like, what is he talking about that he's been working on? And I think the heavy implication here is that it is some kind of like religious experience within.
Oh, because of the steeple?
Yes. What do you think of that sharp analysis, Joanna?
That sort of black hat, white hat analysis of the scene.
That's right.
I don't know. I mean, I think that, I think the themes of religion are one we want to keep a watch on, especially on the mentions of God complexes and that sort of thing. And whatever he's doing, I think it's fascinating that it's so secret and seemingly ambitious.
I see. Should we assume that you know what he's doing at this point?
I think you should assume that I know more about what he's doing than you know.
I see. Gotcha.
But only 2 episodes of like, if you guys don't like me sounding smug, I've only seen 2 more episodes, and then we'll all be on the same page. So.
All right. I'm looking forward to it. So aside from that, we also see Maeve, played by Thandie Newton, experience continuous flashbacks, right? She's getting flashbacks through the whole episode, And at the end, you kind of find out what happened. Like in a previous life, she was a homesteader, and it was like invaded by Native Americans. And then at the last second, the Man in Black comes in. So a lot of questions about this whole situation. Like, firstly, we learned earlier in the episode that the androids have the concept of nightmares, like they grasp it. In case memory wipes are not done correctly, they can just assume that it was a nightmare that they're having, and that allows them to live with whatever memories they might accrue. But was this a former life? Like a former character that she had? Was the Man in Black actually involved, or was she just hallucinating the Man in Black? Because the way the Man in Black enters is kind of weird. Like it looks like this Native American is going to enter, but then the Man in Black suddenly replaces him. So was it always the Man in Black? Was it is she imposing the Man in Black on him? Any thoughts on this, Joanna?
My guess would be, just as we see in this episode, Dolores flash back to the massacre that happened in the pilot as she's standing in the streets of Sweetwater. We know that her father, the original droid playing her father, used to be like a cannibal outlaw or something like that, right? So we know that the droids have played different parts and been part of different storylines. So to me, it seemed like she was once a homesteader who, one of the parts she played would be part of a massacre that either guests or Native American hosts can take part in, which is terrifying. She and her daughter character must have been murdered over and over and over again. So yeah, she's flashing. I think she's flashing back to that sort of harrowing, repeated experience.
Seeing all this death occur on the show, seeing James Marsden get murdered again, seeing the Man in Black walk through and it looks like he's about to scalp her, right? Or stab her or do something horrible to her. It reminds me of what Eli Roth said about Hostel. Did we ever talk about this in any of our podcasts, Joanna? Like Eli Roth and that movie Hostel?
No. I mean, I know Eli Roth and I know Hostel, but we've never talked about it.
So yeah, Eli Roth made this movie called Hostel, and his inspiration for that movie, he said, was he heard about this place in Vietnam where you could pay $10,000 to go into a room and shoot someone in the head. And that idea was absolutely terrifying to him, and that's why he wrote Hostel, which is basically about this club of very rich people, and basically they steal people from hostels and they torture them to death. And like double terror on top of just the idea that someone would pay money to kill someone else is the idea that like once you're in that situation, nothing you do can alleviate your suffering. In fact, the more you beg for mercy and scream or whatever, the other person presumably enjoys it more. And that he found these concepts very terrifying, and that's why he wrote the movie. So why do I bring this up? Because it feels like a lot of the clientele of Westworld is people who like, as I've said, raping and killing. Do you feel like that is too niche of a target audience? Do you feel like the other things that... Like, I'm just saying, like, pretend Westworld existed for real, like, in real life. Like, do you feel like there would be enough people who are interested in the kind of more generic adventure to kind of fund the entire park?
I don't know. I think it's like an immersive kind of, if not VR, then VR-esque experience. Like, I think I would be I have no inclination to go to like an Old West reenactment. Like, if I were to go...
Right.
Didn't we talk about this? Like, which Westworld what world we would want to go to? Or was I talking about that on another podcast?
I think it might have been another podcast.
Oh, okay. Like if a Westworld existed, what time period, what place would you want it to be, or something like that? Right. And I think there are definitely times and places I would want to be, or there's dozens and dozens that would win over the Old West. That being said, if I knew that there was a place where there were androids so advanced that I couldn't tell the difference between them and humans, I think I'd be intrigued enough to go. Whether or not they would get return business from me, I don't, since I'm not of the raping, killing variety. And also, like, I wouldn't want to go and have people raping and killing around me. Like, that's the thing is, like, even if you're, like, say that family
Yeah,
who,
exactly.
like, who went to, like, see Dolores paint stuff and, like, presumably wander around the meadows or whatever, like, you know, people are raping and killing around you. Like, is that a fun time for the whole family? I don't know. So
Right, exactly. Like it would be like Disneyland, but with like more raping and killing. You know what I mean? Like
yeah.
you wouldn't take your kid to Disneyland if there's a bunch of raping and killing there. You know, so it does feel odd. Like I'm kind of wondering, like, would there be enough people? What's the psychographic profile of the average Westworld patron? You know what I'm saying? Like, that's what I'm curious about.
Yeah. So that being said, like, I think when I was doing this thought experiment on another podcast, I think I said I wanted to go to like 19th century London.
Right.
But in that instance, you know, like there would be Jack the Ripper or whatever all around, you know, like there are terrible things happening in any fantasy timeline you go into.
Right.
But yeah, I feel like there should be like, it should be more divided. Do you know, like Disneyland has different parks, right? There's like California Adventureland and regular Disneyland and Futureland. Like I feel like if you're there and you want the G-rated experience, which I think is how isn't that how they talked about it, like G-rated versus R-rated or something like that in the first episode. But like if that's the experience you want, I feel like you should get off at a different train stop. Right? Like not everyone should dump into the town where there are whores wandering the street. I agree.
They've got to have like more kind of discretion between age groups and so on. So
right.
Basically what I'm saying is we should run this park, Joanna.
Yeah,
I mean,
nothing would go wrong.
We clearly know better than the people who are already running it. On that note, I really kind of dig how they're like slowly revealing more info about Ed Harris's character. I just hope it goes somewhere. But you know, there is a scene in this episode where one person, they're like, you kind of get a cut of the overseeing room, like the big map room where they have like the scale model or whatever of Westworld, and someone says, "Hey, wow, he's really plowing through all these people. He's killing all these dudes real fast." And I think Luke Hemsworth, the least of the Hemsworth brothers,
that's true,
says something like, "That man gets whatever he wants."
Yeah,
right.
He does.
So that could be, you know, that he is one of the most rich patrons of the park, or it could be that he is, you know,
someone just reminded me
some kind of elaborate, you know, host, right?
Right.
Which is another theory. Go ahead.
One of our listeners, pen and paper, just sort of blew a hole in my VR theory, I think, unintentionally. They wrote, it just seems like in the future, making it virtual reality would be much more efficient than robots. And I agree. But, like, I guess why would we have that scene where Thandie Newton sees them, like, hosing down the dead robots and, like, redressing them and stuff like that? Like,
right.
If it's VR, unless the whole thing is VR, like, the Delos company is also VR. But...
Right, but
yeah.
Maybe it's like, you know how Steve Jobs' philosophy was when you open up the iPhone, it should look beautiful on the inside, too, even though no one's ever going to open it up? Maybe by the same token... hey, this VR world should be like internally consistent, you know? So if we need to like do a reset of the androids and hose them off, like we should actually do that in the VR world.
Yeah. I think I just let my VR theory go into the wind.
One of the best theories, I think, is that firstly, one of the elements of the Westworld movie is that they can't get the hands right, the machines. And like that's how you tell the difference between the hand, like the like machines and humans, right?
Yeah.
Now in Westworld the show, they make mention of how like the earlier machines, like the hands were a dead giveaway, right? Like that's what they said, I think, in episode 1. And so some people have pointed out that the Man in Black, played by Ed Harris, is always wearing gloves. I don't think we've seen his hands yet. So perhaps he could be an older model of machine that's running amok in the park somehow via controlled fashion?
I think one of the stronger theories, and this was reflected in the chat room just now, but I've seen it around, is that like the incident that they talk about 30 years previous, right? They talk about this incident that happened 30 years ago. theory is that like something happened, like maybe to the Men in Black's family or something like that. Like they died at the park in a way that, you and I have been speculating why more people don't die that way at the park. And so part of his like settlement, if he sued them or something like that, was like he gets to do whatever the hell he wants in the park for the rest of his life. So that's a theory that people have. The other big theory, the theory that caught, I think, a lot of people's attention this week is a really elaborate one that I can't really throw my full heart behind because of things I know of the future, but a guess that I think I'm going to have to rewatch the next 2 episodes to figure out exactly how much I want to throw a wet blanket on this theory. But the theory is that Jimmy Simpson's character Lawrence and Ben Bargan's character Logan, that their adventure is actually 30 years in the past. And what we're seeing with them happened 30 years ago, and that Jimmy Simpson's white-headed character is going to turn into Ed Harris. And so that their storyline, the Jimmy Simpson and Ben Barnes storyline, the William and Logan storyline is going to end with the quote-unquote incident of 30 years ago. And if you watch it, which I did this tonight with that theory in mind, they interact with Clementine, the Maeve's second in command, second in command, and they interact with Dolores. William does. Those 2 characters, I think Dolores is in like sort of glitchy mode right before she interacts with him. So I think that's our biggest tip off. But like otherwise, we don't see them do anything that hooks them directly into the current narrative that we're seeing.
You just blew my mind, Joanna Robinson.
Whether or not
that is nuts.
Whether or not that sustains, I don't know. I don't think it does, but like this is based on this week's episode. This is a theory that's sort of catching fire around the internet, and I think it would be. It's certainly pretty like Nolan of The Prestige. Like this is prestige-y, right? Or like Matthew McConaughey was the ghost in your bookshelf all the time. So that seems like a kind of a Nolan-esque twist that they would try to pull off, and it would make sense for us to watch William be this hero that we want to root for, watch his story concurrently with Ed Harris enacting these atrocities, right, and then like not knowing that their stories are going to dovetail. So, yeah,
crazy. Crazy.
Someone in the chat just said Bran is Max von Sydow, which is a nod to Game of Thrones theories. Thank you for that, listener. But yeah, it's a stretch, and we'll look. Let's look next week and see if we can see something that disproves it. But I think within the context of this episode, I think the other evidence is that.
By the way, my favorite comment in the chat room is Chandra Nunnally today saying, "Speculation: the show will catch up and then surpass Martin's novel."
Yeah,
that was very funny. Anyway, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Oh no. I think, well, I should say that I first read this theory today over in slashfilm.com because Peter Surratt is doing a weekly, we made reference to it last week, but Peter is doing a weekly sort of Westworld theories post. So I thought that was the most intriguing one that his roundup this week, and he, I think, pulled it from Reddit. But the logo when Logan and William pull into the station is different than the logo we saw last week. So some people think it's like the 30-year-old logo or something.
Okay. I'm totally on board with this theory.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
Crazy. Yeah. All right. Well, before we wrap it up for today, I do want to just give a shout out to Wiki Rascals, who made our podcast art. So really appreciate that. I think he produced our podcast art in probably like 90 minutes. After we came,
and it only took him that, and it took him that long because he was like at lunch when we asked him. Yeah. He would have done it even faster.
Really appreciate him coming through with that. You can find his work at wikirascals.com. That's WIKI rascals.com. Also, David Vermontes, I think, also sent us some album art that was inspired by the podcast.
Beautiful.
It was very nice. So just wanted to say we appreciate that, and for all the people who have supported and downloaded this podcast, do want to say if you have enjoyed this podcast, we would greatly appreciate you leaving a review for us on iTunes. It will help more people find the podcast, and who knows where this thing will go. So the more people that find us, the more time and energy we can commit to it. So do leave us a rating at the very least. Check off a star rating or leave us a review on iTunes. And find more episodes of the show at decodingwestworld.com. You can always email us at decodingwestworld@gmail.com. So until next week, Joanna Robinson, where can people find more of your work on the internet this week?
I'm still talking about Game of Thrones over on the Storm of Spoilers podcast, or you can listen to me talk about Oscar-worthy films, including this week I'll be talking about La La Land over on Little Gold Men, or you can find me on VanityFair.com or on Twitter at Joe Wrote This.
Find all of my stuff at davechen.me, and find my film The Primary Instinct on Hulu and at theprimaryinstinct.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.